Black waitress left a $2 tip. Years later, she owned the restaurant. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the small diner where she worked, their cold flicker casting tired shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The air smelled of coffee that had been left too long on the burner, and the cracked booths held regulars, who spoke to one another without ever acknowledging the woman, who moved quietly between them. She carried plates heavy with grease and wiped, down counters that never seemed to stay clean. To the customers, she was invisible, a fixture of the place like the chipped salt shakers or the squeaky ceiling fan. Her name was Evelyn, and night after night, she stood on her aching feet, serving smiles that masked the weariness etched into her bones. Evelyn had grown used to the invisibility. She had grown used to being overlooked, her labor taken for granted, her presence barely acknowledged. But what no one saw was the silent strength that lived within her. Beneath her apron and the exhaustion that clung to her skin, she carried a dream so delicate she barely spoke it aloud. She wanted more than survival. She wanted a life where she was not just the one pouring coffee and cleaning tables, but someone who could decide her own future. That dream, fragile as it was, kept her alive in a world that seemed designed to crush people like her. On one of those endless nights, when her shift stretched longer than her body could bear, Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled $2 bill. It was all she had left after paying her rent and buying groceries that barely lasted the week. For most people, it would have been nothing, a scrap of paper, a tip that might not even buy a bus fare. But to Evelyn, that $2 bill carried weight. She placed it on the counter before leaving for the night. Not as a careless gesture, but as a quiet promise. It was her way of reminding herself that even when she had almost nothing, she still had something to give, something to believe in. That act, so small it seemed insignificant, became a moment frozen in time, one that would echo far beyond the walls of the tired diner. The walk home was long and cold, her thin jacket doing little against the night air. Streetlights buzzed faintly above her as she made her way through cracked sidewalks and empty streets. Every step reminded her of how precarious her life was, balanced on the edge of bills and responsibilities that always seemed heavier than her paycheck. Yet as her shoes scuffed against the pavement, she carried with her a quiet fire, a refusal to let the world dictate who she was meant to be. That $2 bill left behind symbolized more than just money. It was a seed planted in soil no one else could see, waiting for its time to grow. The diner itself was a reflection of Evelyn's life. Its counters were scratched, its paint chipped, its neon sign half dead, flickering against the night sky. Customers came and went without a second glance, never noticing the struggle of the people who kept the place alive. But Evelyn noticed. She noticed everything, the way the owner barked at workers, the way tips were pocketed unfairly, the way her fellow servers tried to hide their pain behind forced smiles. She noticed the quiet injustices that piled up like dirty dishes, each one small but together creating a weight that was almost unbearable. She also noticed something else. Despite its wear and its neglect, the diner had potential. In the late hours, when the clatter of dishes died down and the booths sat empty, she would allow herself to imagine. She imagined what it would look like with fresh paint on the walls, with new tables that didn't wobble, with lights that didn't flicker like tired stars. She imagined it as a place of warmth and pride, not just survival. She never said it aloud, but in her heart, she dreamed of owning it one day. The world outside the diner was not kind to black women like Evelyn. Discrimination lurked in every shadow, spoken or unspoken, and the weight of being underestimated was one she carried daily. She knew how people looked at her, just another waitress, just another face, just another person to be ignored. But she also knew something they didn't. She knew that survival had sharpened her. That hardship had taught her patience, resilience, and courage. She had learned to endure storms without breaking, and though no one saw it, she was gathering the strength to build something greater than herself. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling of her small apartment, Evelyn thought of the $2 bill she had left behind. She thought of how meaningless it might seem to others, and yet how much it meant to her. It wasn't just money, it was a reminder that she still had choices, still had dignity, still had a future that could be hers if she fought hard enough. In the silence of her room, she made herself a vow. One day, she would return to that diner not as a waitress, but as its owner. The years that followed were not easy. Life pressed down on her with the same relentless weight it always had. She worked double shifts, saved every penny she could, and endured the endless grind of days that blurred together. There were times when the dream felt foolish, when exhaustion whispered that she should give up, accept her place, and stop reaching for something that seemed impossible. But every time doubt crept in, she remembered the $2 bill. She remembered that night and the quiet promise she had made to herself. That memory became her anchor, keeping her steady when the world tried to pull her under. What Evelyn didn't know was how that promise, so small and private, would eventually return to her in ways she could never have imagined. The $2 bill was not gone, not forgotten. It remained in the shadows of her story, waiting for the moment when it would resurface and change everything. And when it did, it would not only transform her life but also force everyone who had ever overlooked her to finally see the strength they had ignored. For now, she carried the dream silently, tucked away like a secret treasure. To the world, she was still just Evelyn, the black waitress who worked long hours and went home to a small apartment. But inside, she was so much more. Inside, she was building something no one could see yet. Inside, she was preparing for the day when the world would look at her and finally realize that the woman they had dismissed was capable of far more than they had ever imagined. And the diner, the very place where she had once been invisible, would become the stage where that realization unfolded. The years moved like slow tides, carrying Evelyn through days that felt endless and nights that never seemed to bring rest. The diner remained the center of her existence, its greasy smell and humming lights wrapping around her life like a cage. Every morning, she put on the same faded uniform and tied the same weary apron around her waist, bracing herself for the hours ahead. She watched as customers came in with impatience, barely noticing the hands that poured their coffee or cleared their plates. To them, she was still invisible. But to Evelyn, every shift was another brick in the unseen foundation of her dream. She saved relentlessly, folding bills into envelopes she kept tucked in a shoebox beneath her bed. Rent, groceries, and bus fare always came first. But whatever was left, even if only a single dollar, went into that box. It grew slowly, agonizingly slowly, like drops of water filling a bucket. Yet every contribution mattered. Each bill reminded her that she was still fighting, still moving toward something greater. She lived with almost nothing, denying herself small pleasures, so she could hold on to the possibility of a future where she was no longer bound to the grind of servitude. But life had its ways of testing her resolve. There were weeks when emergencies drained her savings, a sudden rent increase, a medical bill she hadn't expected, the time her bus route shut down and she had to spend extra just to get to work. Each setback hit like a cruel blow, forcing her to start over, to scrape together the pieces of her dream all over again. More than once she thought of giving up. More than once, she wondered if she was being foolish to hold onto a vision that seemed so far out of reach. Yet in the quiet of her room, with exhaustion pressing heavy against her chest, she remembered the promise she had made to herself the night she left that $2 bill on the counter. That promise whispered to her when the world told her to quit. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Evelyn allowed herself to imagine what life might look like if she succeeded. She pictured herself walking into the diner with her head high, not in a uniform but in her own clothes, not to take orders but to give them. She imagined painting the walls fresh, replacing the tired booths, turning the place into somewhere people wanted to be, somewhere that reflected pride instead of neglect. These images became her fuel, her private escape from the monotony of each day. Still, the road was brutal. For a black woman in her city, opportunities were scarce and barriers endless. Promotions never came her way. Better jobs went to others who hadn't worked half as hard as she had. Landlords treated her with suspicion. Banks turned her away with cold politeness. And society at large seemed content to keep her invisible. Yet she refused to surrender. Each slight, each rejection only hardened her resolve. She was not just working for herself anymore. She was working against every voice that told her she would never rise above her station. One winter evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Evelyn sat in the back of the diner, resting her aching feet. The owner was complaining again, his voice sharp with disdain as he barked at the staff about sales being down. Evelyn listened quietly, noting the cracks in his words, the desperation he tried to hide. For the first time, she realized something. The diner wasn't invincible. For all its presence in her life, for all the years she had given to it, the place was vulnerable. And vulnerability meant possibility. She began to pay closer attention after that night. She noticed the overdue bills piling on the owner's desk, the way suppliers seemed to hesitate before delivering, the quiet tension in his tone when he spoke about money. The diner was struggling, and though it pained her to see it decay further, it also stirred something deep within her. If the place fell apart, it would mean more hardship for her and her co-workers. But if it was teetering, it also meant one thing. One day, it might be within her reach. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She was still far from having enough savings, still far from being taken seriously by banks or lenders. Yet the image of owning the diner grew sharper in her mind, no longer just a dream, but a potential future. She doubled down on her efforts, taking extra shifts, cutting back on food, living in near poverty to gather every cent she could. The shoebox beneath her bed grew heavier, even if the weight of it was invisible to everyone but her. But the world wasn't done testing her. One night, as she was walking home, she was followed. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, quickening when she tried to speed up. Fear gripped her, cold and suffocating, as she turned down a darker street to get away. When the figure caught up, it wasn't a stranger but a former co-worker, someone who had always sneered at her ambition. He laughed cruelly, telling her that women like her would never get anywhere, that she was wasting her life on a fantasy. The words cut deep, sharper than any knife. Yet even as she trembled, Evelyn clenched her fists and refused to let those words sink in. She walked away, her heart pounding, knowing she had just survived more than a threat in the night. She had survived another attempt to break her spirit. That incident marked a turning point. Evelyn realized that if she was going to make it, she would have to endure not just hardship but hostility, not just indifference but active attempts to tear her down. And she was willing to do it. She carried herself back into the diner with her head a little higher, her steps a little firmer. She was tired, yes, but she was no longer just waiting for life to change. She was preparing herself to change it. Still, the diner's decline became harder to ignore. Fewer customers filled the booths. The neon sign flickered more desperately, and the owner's temper grew shorter. Whispers of closure drifted through the staff like smoke. Some feared losing their jobs, others quietly searched for work elsewhere. Evelyn listened to all of it, her heart beating with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. She wasn't ready yet, not fully, but she was closer than she had ever been. One evening, as she counted her tips in the dim glow of her apartment, Evelyn opened the shoebox and spread out the bills across her bed. The sight filled her with pride and fear. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was proof. Proof that she was building something. Proof that she wasn't powerless. She touched the worn bills with trembling hands and thought of what she could make them become. And then came the moment that would change everything. At the end of a late shift, the owner called her into his office. His voice was clipped, his eyes darting with unease. He spoke of debts, of bills he could no longer pay, of a future that looked darker than he was willing to admit. Evelyn listened in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. She had waited years for an opening, for the smallest crack in the wall that separated her from her dream. Now, as the words tumbled out of his mouth, she realized that the crack had finally appeared. But the question was she ready to step through it? The silence in the owner's office hung heavy, thick with the weight of failure. His words were clipped, his eyes restless, as he confessed to the struggles he could no longer mask. The diner was crumbling, and the fortress that had once seemed so solid in Evelyn's life was revealing its cracks. She listened quietly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. It was the moment she had both feared and longed for, the moment she had whispered to herself on nights when hope seemed too fragile to hold. Now it was here, and it terrified her. She returned home that night in a daze, her mind spinning faster than her weary body could keep pace. She opened the shoebox beneath her bed, pulling out the stacks of bills she had guarded for years. She laid them across the bed, watching the pile form into a tangible picture of her sacrifice. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to buy a diner, but it was something. It was proof she had built her life on more than sweat and dreams. Still, the question gnawed at her. How could a woman like her, dismissed and underestimated her entire life, step into ownership of something so large? The following days tested her resolve in ways she had never known. The owner grew more erratic, his frustration boiling over into sharp words and rash decisions. Customers dwindled further, suppliers grew impatient, and whispers among the staff turned into resignation letters slipped quietly onto his desk. The diner was collapsing faster than anyone expected, and yet Evelyn felt something stirring within her. This was no longer just about a dream, it was about survival. If the diner closed, she and countless others would lose their livelihoods. And if it changed hands, she knew the staff would be discarded. Replaced without thought, she began researching in the shadows of her exhaustion. She visited libraries on her rare days off, scouring books on small business ownership, finances, and entrepreneurship. She listened to stories of others who had started with nothing, clinging to the parallels that reminded her she wasn't alone. She asked discreet questions of community members who had managed to open shops, and each answer became a stepping stone. Slowly, a plan formed. But plans required courage, and courage was harder to summon than she imagined. One night, as she stared at her savings spread across the bed, her hands lingered over a bill that felt different from the rest. She smoothed it out carefully, realizing it was the same $2 bill she had left behind years earlier. Somehow, in her meager earnings and careful savings, it had resurfaced. She had forgotten it, yet it had found its way back to her. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, tears welling in her eyes. That bill wasn't just paper. It was a reminder of who she had been and of who she had always wanted to become. The symbolism filled her with fire. She walked back into the diner the next morning with her chin higher, her steps firmer. When the owner once again muttered about debts and losses, she spoke, calmly, firmly, asking him what it would take to keep the diner afloat. His laugh was sharp, bitter, dismissive. He told her ownership wasn't for people like her, that she didn't have what it took. His words stung, but they didn't pierce. She had heard them before from others and from life itself. Now, instead of breaking her, they only hardened her resolve. Over the weeks that followed, she began to move carefully, strategically. She spoke to community leaders, people who had seen her work tirelessly for years, people who respected her even if they hadn't always noticed her. She explained her vision, her determination to keep the diner alive, not as a failing relic but as a thriving hub. Some dismissed her, others quietly encouraged her, and a few extended small offers of help, guidance, advice, even introductions to credit unions that lent to minorities when banks would not. The path was grueling. She faced rejection after rejection, paperwork stacked higher than her hope could reach, and endless voices telling her to quit. But each setback was met with the image of that $2 bill, folded neatly in her pocket. It reminded her that she had already built something from nothing once, and she could do it again. Then at last the day came. The owner, defeated and weary, announced his decision to close the diner for good. The words hit the staff like a blow, their fears confirmed. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She stepped forward, heart pounding, and offered her proposal. The room fell silent. The owner's laugh was sharp again, cruel, dismissive, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, desperation. He needed a way out, and though he wouldn't admit it, she was offering him one. Negotiations were brutal. He doubted her, belittled her, tried to squeeze more from her than she could afford. But Evelyn held firm. Piece by piece, she presented her plan, her support from the community, her scraped-together savings, and her relentless determination. Days stretched into weeks, and by the time papers were signed, Evelyn had given everything she had, and more. The day she held the keys in her hand, she stood outside the diner in silence. The neon sign still flickered weakly above her. The booths inside still sagged with wear, the tiles still cracked underfoot. But it was hers. For the first time in her life, she wasn't serving someone else's dream. She was standing in the doorway of her own. The transformation was slow, but it was unstoppable. She painted the walls fresh, replaced the booths, and repaired the sign until it glowed proudly in the night. Word spread through the community that the diner had a new owner. And not just any owner, a woman who had once served coffee, there now ran the entire place. People came not just for meals, but to witness the miracle of resilience. Evelyn changed the menu, modernized the kitchen, and created a space where people felt welcome. Her staff was treated with dignity, their efforts acknowledged and rewarded. For the first time, they were more than invisible hands. They were part of a vision built on respect. And when she opened the register each night, she kept one thing separate from the rest, that $2 bill, now framed on the wall behind the counter. Customers asked about it, curious about the story. She would smile, her eyes shining, and simply say that it was where it all began. Years later, the diner thrived. No longer just a place of greasy meals and flickering signs, but a landmark of hope. Evelyn stood at its center. No longer unseen, no longer dismissed, but recognized for the courage that had carried her through. The girl who once left a crumpled bill on a counter had become the woman who built an empire of dignity from it. Her journey was not without scars, but those scars told a story louder than any words. They told of resilience, of pride, of a quiet waitress who had once been invisible, but who now stood unshakable in the light of her own triumph. And as the sun set over the glowing diner, the $2 bill gleamed beneath its frame, whispering the truth Evelyn had always known, but the world had tried to silence. That greatness can rise from the smallest beginnings, and that dignity once claimed can never again be taken away.